things to work.
Okay. What do you need to know?
I want to know how to record first.
The amount of supplies they're going to need, the man hours that are involved. And certainly if you'll think of your own organization, don't almost every other department, don't they all have plans for which they are held accountable? So if you have been, as so many of our colleagues, among those who say, well, you know, I really know what I'm doing, I don't need to get formal about it, I don't need to put it down on paper, I would simply ask you to please investigate that attitude, because it is the great barrier to really effective public relations. I simply don't know how you can conduct an effective public relations activity without a plan in the first place. A plan is a roadmap, you all know that, and if you don't have a map, you don't know where you're going, and you don't know how to get there. But there's something else about a plan, and in the model we're going to share with you, I think this alone makes it worth our while to do some pretty sophisticated planning. And that's that wonderful little item called mid-course correction. Is there anybody here that's ever had an annual budget that didn't get changed in the middle? Raise your hand. You ever had? You never saw one, did you, that didn't get changed in the middle? Well, when that occurs, how do we adjust our work to fit? Or have you ever had a year in which some new goals didn't suddenly arise because there were opportunities, or perhaps there were crises and problems? Have you ever had a month, indeed, when there weren't some changes? Well, without a course charted, how do we make those changes? It's kind of just reach in our pocket and kind of make a selection, right? And just go with it. Well, one thing about a plan that we have learned from years of working rigorously with clients on the plans is that at last we have a tool, I will even go so far as to call it a protective device, to shield us and our programs against those inevitable changes. Because now we have a document that we can talk about, and that we can make adjustments and accommodations, and we can cut a deal, if you will, with the client, with the management, about what is going to be changed and what isn't. Without that piece of paper, well, I don't have to tell you, you've been in those meetings. Without that piece of paper, what is the result when change occurs? We are totally at the hands of someone else, following their perceptions about what we do. So I'm not going to spend any more time talking about why we need to plan. I think that it's pretty self-evident, but I do want to make a couple of points. We have found in working with a number of types of institutions that planning really to be well done is at least a 2 or 3 day effort and probably a week. And for most of the clients that we work with, be they school districts or hospitals or corporations or public interest groups, we set aside a time in the year when that week is going to be cut out from other activities and when that plan is going to be laid out. Now, the inevitable resistance to that is, oh my gosh, I can't give a week to this. Well, I won't argue about the opposite side of that, which is if you don't have this, you may be giving a week every week in overtime, Saturdays, and so forth. But I wonder if the question really isn't to examine that week and see how much time it may save during the course of the year. Our evidence is, and I'm talking about a lot of organizations that resist kicking and screaming, putting 2 or 3 days or a week into a plan. Our evidence is that once that plan is in place, you will save at least 3 or 4 weeks of effort during the year. So think about setting aside a block of time to do the plan. The one other preliminary point that I want to share with you from our experience and the experience of others with whom we have worked is that planning, by definition, is a participative process. For you or the public relations unit to go off somewhere and do the plan is certainly better than no plan at all. The problem is that it's your plan, it's our plan. If we can involve others in the organization in at least part of that planning process, and as we go through the model, we'll suggest some portions where really we need total organizational or total managerial involvement. If we can involve those folks, now it's our plan, and they also have some ownership in the plan. I don't think I need to spend any time talking about what happens when it's our plan and the only ownership is ours. versus a plan that has indeed been worked out with all of the other people who are involved in the decision-making process or are going to be involved either in wanting the results from the plan or in perhaps carrying it out. So what we're finding is set aside a time. If you can only give it 2 days, give it 2 days. But set aside a time to plan and don't do anything else. And then involve other people in the organization in the planning process. Planning for public relations activities is not something to be done just by the department or off in a closet. Well, if we're going to plan, obviously we're talking about goal-oriented public relations management by objective, if you prefer that term. What are the characteristics that a plan like this might be able to give you? One of the important characteristics is that if you have a plan, only then can we truly say we are proactive and keeping daily operations from running our shop. Now, I know none of you have any problem with daily operations running your shop, but there's a wonderful thing about really having a plan that you can point to. At last, you can say to fellow managers, look, I know that seems important to you right now, but it isn't as important as this ongoing long-term goal which we have planned for this time period. So if we're going to be proactive, if we're going to look down the road, we need a plan that takes into account all the things that we know about public relations activities. We also need a plan that takes into account all the ways we relate to our publics. So, in fact, when you talk about planning, you're talking about something far bigger than planning. Public relations has a growing body of knowledge. Most of us, I hope, are aware of that. It's a large body of knowledge. In fact, it's really this body of knowledge that qualifies public relations to be an emerging profession. Because remember, what makes a group a profession are 2 characteristics. First, the particular subject must be something that is involved in everyone's daily living anywhere on the globe. In other words, every human must find this subject endemic to their life. Law is a profession because we have agreed that you cannot have mob rule and power running society. Instead, you have laws, you have legislation. And we agree to live under those laws, but of course there are disagreements, so we need lawyers to straighten out those disagreements and help us understand and use the law. The healthcare professions are professions because obviously mental and physical health are endemic to successful human life. And so on with the other professions. If you stop to think about it, of all the fields that have come to grow around public relations, basic public relations is probably the only one that really qualifies as a profession. It qualifies because indeed our life, our society, the organizations in which we work, if you scrape everything else away, are nothing more than a group of relationships among people in your community, in our nation, on the globe, in your organization. And these relationships involve communication and reputation and issues and crises and all of the other elements that indeed are part of public relations practice. So on that score, public relations truly qualifies as a profession, and it has this body of knowledge. The other characteristic that makes a profession is the actual definition of a profession. A profession is defined as an art applied to a science in a way that the public interest takes precedent over personal gain. Well, certainly, public relations has the art. That's where we've been concentrating all these years. Increasingly now, as the body of knowledge is codified, as additional scholars help us with our work, we have a very large science. And just to practice public relations is indeed in the public interest, because how else would a democratic society function? So that what separates professionals from others, therefore, is really how we apply this body of knowledge, the art, and when we apply it, the science. Therefore, a planning method of any value must keep application of this body of knowledge constantly in our minds. The best possible planning process would be one, therefore, which is a substitute for memory, one that doesn't force us to always think back into this broad body of knowledge, but includes the body of knowledge right in the planning process, or at least large and important portions of the body of knowledge. The planning process that we're going to share with you is geared to do this. And let me just very quickly share some of the key points of theory that this process involves. First, in any planning process, the theory of publics has to be first. You and I today probably talk about it more as audience targeting or some such term, but obviously you can't deal with 100% of the folks out there at any one time. In fact, we know more and more there is no general public. You can't ever deal with 100% of the general public. You couldn't even if it was possible, because you will never have the budget or the person power available to do it. And so we have the theory of publics. Well, what is a public? A public, essentially, is a group that shares a common interest around your subject. Shares a common interest around your subject. And we have to remember that there are both organized and unorganized publics. Sometimes our publics will be organized. In healthcare, we deal with doctors, for example, and certainly they have their medical societies and they have their organization right within the healthcare institution. Other times we may be dealing with mothers of young children. Well, there is no mothers of young children society in most places, but we may be able to find them in certain other organizations, even if they themselves haven't gotten together and organized. So we know that they share a common interest. We know they may be organized or unorganized. What else do we know about publics that will help us in the planning process to make sure we can list them and prioritize them? One is that the old idea of publics as large groups, as mass publics, is now breaking down very rapidly. In fact, the predictions by the scholars of this field are that there is no longer a mass public. If you want to visualize that, think of 5, 10, 15 years ago when we were all electronically connected, but our role was passive. We all sat in front of the tube. We were all watching the same thing, perhaps simultaneously, but we just sat there and the messages came to us. And now today, we're all still electronically connected, but we're connected in front of a computer terminal. Well, first of all, you can't just sit there. It won't do anything. You have to do something. So immediately, there's involvement. Furthermore, because everybody has the capability of inputting as well as getting information, we can personalize it right down to the individual. And so the McLuhan scholar, the successor of Marshall McLuhan at the University of Toronto, now says PR no longer stands for public relations. It stands for personal, or at least personalized relations. And so those wonderful old headings, if we were doing a healthcare plan, we'd put the medical community and we'd put patients and we'd put volunteers. Now those increasingly just become that, headings. And the key to audience targeting is how many subgroups can we list under those headings? Because it's in the networking that goes on in those subgroups that the action now takes place. Getting all of those folks as a larger public together on any topic, or reaching them with some information or sharing some feelings, is just increasingly difficult because, indeed, of this personalization. The second point I think that we need to be aware of, theoretically, in doing our planning, is that these publics work by networking. And that in networking, the key actors are opinion leaders. And so if we're going to be able to get headings over our types of publics and subgroups under those headings of specific publics, the next question is, if we're going to influence those subgroups, how do they network together? And who are the opinion leaders that really control the flow and acceptance of information and influence in that networking process? Now, we know a good deal about opinion leaders. Those of you who have heard me or folks from our firm or others talk on these subjects before know that the whole underpinning of public relations practice is diffusion process. Well, I won't give you diffusion process again today. You're probably all tired of hearing that. If you're not familiar with diffusion process, give me your business card, though, and I'll be glad to send you a short tape on diffusion process. Diffusion process is now in its 51st year of academic study. It postulates that the way relationships are built and communications are effective is in a two-step process. The first is mass or somewhat mass communication, which can be very impersonal. It can use media, whether it's news media or your own printed or visual or other media, because its goal is simply to make people aware of the subject and see if we can lure them into interest. Beyond that, however, communication has almost no power to help us answer the so what question. And that's the hard thing, I think, for those of us who all these years have depended upon what the communication scholars told us, which is now unraveling. The second step of two-step flow, after communication makes people aware and hopefully lures some of them to share an interest, is social reinforcement of the idea. In other words, I become aware of it because I read something maybe in the newspaper. I'm interested, so I seek out a brochure or a film or some material that you have put together for your organization. Now, the postulation has always been that, oh, I read that stuff and I said, wow, I'm going to make up my mind. Yeah, but that's treating, you see, Americans like the old frontier cowboy, where we're all independent and we're really thinking for ourselves. The trouble is that the behavioral sciences cannot find any people like that. What they find is a society where everyone, on almost every subject, wants to verify their ideas through interactions with other people that are important in their lives, opinion leaders in their lives. So the second step of two-step flow, the way I really make up my mind whether my interest in your subject is one that I will follow through, is by checking it out with other human beings. And those other human beings, of course, are opinion leaders, family members, spouses, folks that we gather around the water cooler in our work groups, those kind of opinion leaders. So this two-step flow that the diffusion process is tells us that we need to know who opinion leaders are, and we need to know the limits of the capability of communication. We know a lot about opinion leaders. Maybe it's worth just taking a minute. Stacy, you keep me on the straight and narrow here for time. Maybe it's worth just listing what we know about opinion leaders. You know, it's funny. Otto Lerbinger, who's going to speak tonight, and I were having a kind of an argument the other day about opinion leaders. We're both in agreement that those are the key people in society, and that more and more as we become personalized, that they are the ones who really make public relations programs work. But Otto's worried about that term because, you know, we've been talking about opinion leaders for what? Oh gosh, 60 or 70 years it's been in the social science literature. So if you want to make a real contribution to the field, come up with a sexy new name for opinion leaders, and Otto will bless it with his academic credentials, and you'll probably go down in the record books. So don't be put off just because that's an old term. Opinion leaders are still the key, and as I say, if you have a better name, let's use it. What do we know about opinion leaders? If you were going to list the opinion leaders that were critical to your organization, what characteristics would you look for? Well, one of the things about an opinion leader is that they have to have a following. I mean, what good are they if they don't have a following? That's obvious. More and more we also find psychologically that opinion leaders are positivists. Now you probably have in your organization or in the publics with whom you work some of those constant naysayers. No matter what you say, it's always wrong, it won't work. And sometimes I think we tend to view those people as opinion leaders. But the psychologists tell us no, not so. That other people can only follow a naysayer for a very short period of time. It's basic human psychology. The psychologists, you know, like to put things right down in the simplest terms. And so they talk about love and hate. And that a person that is always negative indeed is on the side of hate. And that a positive person is on the side of love. And they point out that a person that spends more time on the hate side of the balance is indeed by definition mentally unhealthy. Well, if that is the case, and the psychologists seem to agree on this, then it follows that a person whom others are going to listen to is going to be a positive person who sees that problems can be solved and opportunities can be taken advantage of. Now, those kind of people have another characteristic, and that is that almost always they are also activists. If they know something can be done, they say, well, let's do it. Let's get it done. And so these folks with the following who are positivists and activists become our opinion leaders, but they also have to have some other characteristics. One of them is that they have to get around. I mean, it's nice to have a following. Once in a while we get to work, all of us, with opinion leaders who are just so well known in their field or in our community that their opinion really sways others. The trouble is they're not networking out there to do much of that suasion. And so the best opinion leaders are those who also get around. Now, I put that in quotes because, of course, some of the very best opinion leaders get around by not going anywhere. People come to them. I don't have to tell all you New Englanders where we do our political work, right? It's at the dump on Saturday, right? And we stand there, and everybody comes to us. We don't go to them, but we're getting around by doing that. How about the CEO's secretary? Now, there's an opinion leader in most organizations. She, and it usually is a she, sits, and we all go there. But the networking is going on. So I'm putting getting around in quotes. Another thing that we have learned recently is that opinion leaders, to be useful in public relations activities, have to be interested to start with. We used to think we could find someone that had these other characteristics in the group, the publics that we were working with, and then we would sell them on our ideas. And now we have found that, frankly, it's just a waste of energy. Find the best opinion leaders you can who are already interested and committed. Don't try and sell people off some other subject and onto yours. The energy that goes into it, frankly, just holds up the process most of the time. And then there's one other thing, of course, and that is that an opinion leader has to have credibility with his or her following. And here is why opinion leaders are so critical, why they are indeed the basic building block of this new personalized relations. There are two elements, psychologically, in credibility, as I'm sure you know. One of them is trustworthiness. And of course, that's what the opinion leader brings to the party. They come having a following because they are trustworthy. The interesting thing, and what makes this system a perfect circle, is that the second quality credibility demands is expertise. Now, if we can find opinion leaders, if we can make lists of them the way we make media lists now, and then build relationships and communications with them, we can continually increase their expertise so they get better and better and better opinion leaders. They already have the trustworthiness, and we have the capability of making them real experts on the particular subject. Well, there's a lot of material on opinion leader theory. I'm sure you're familiar with a great deal of it. Let's just leave it at that. But certainly we have to know the theory of publics. A planning process has to understand that. It has to understand the role of opinion leaders, the two-step flow. One of the other critical theories that the planning process has to encounter is something like this. I talked about the two-step flow and about the limits of communication. Well, let's follow that train from the beginning. The first step in any communication is information transfer. That's just simple. I send you some information, you hopefully send me some back. The trouble is that it's a totally impersonal thing. There's no feedback involved. It's just transferring information. So we try to go a step further to communication. The difference here being that, of course, true communication is a two-way activity in which you can ask questions, you can respond with feedback and your opinions on the information that is transferred. And so we try to move beyond information transfer to communication. The trouble is that communication is cognitive, it's just head games. And so we try to gear our communication to go that next step. And the next step, of course, is relationships. And there is a huge difference between a relationship and communication. In fact, if you'll think for just a minute, you can think of folks you know with whom you have merely communication. You communicate with them perhaps somewhat regularly, but you don't really know those people. You don't know what makes them tick. You don't know what their motivations are, what their emotional balance is, much about their personal life. And now contrast that with someone with whom you truly have a relationship, where you do know those things. Obviously, one is 10 times more powerful than the other. So the goal of our communication is to build relationships. The reason that we want to build relationships is because behaviors, which again is our goal, behaviors come from relationships, not from communication. The reason for that is very simple. A relationship builds trust. And I am willing, perhaps, to behave in a certain way if I trust you. But it's doubtful I'm going to behave in a way that you may suggest I do, just because you have communicated with me, even if you let me ask questions. And it's a two-way communication. So we need to know in our planning process, when is this sufficient? When do we have to go to this? And when do we really have to move to this level of sophistication? Now, when you talk about relationships and behaviors, you're talking, of course, about behavioral science. The behavioral science studies that are available to us would fill this room probably 20 or 30 times. It's a huge body of knowledge. But there are 4 elements from the behavioral sciences that I think are essential to the public relations process and certainly to the planning process. And let me just share those with you. Some of you will be very familiar with these. I don't think there are any surprises here, but let's just get them back in focus because we need them in a planning model that is going to force us to use what we know from the behavioral science body of knowledge. First is a rule from the sociologists called the rule of abuse. The rule of abuse reads like this. Any negative change in a relationship is the result of an abuse by one of the parties. Any negative change in a relationship results from an abuse by one of the parties. Now, just think about your home life, and if you ever get into an argument at home, doesn't one of the parties either think or actually say that they're being abused? If you just think about that a little bit, I think you'll agree with me that that's essentially what's going on. Well, of course, that also is true in larger groups. The problem with the rule of abuse is that if you wish to build relationships or even to communicate or even transfer information to a public, and they are feeling an abuse toward your organization, the psychologists tell us they cannot even hear what you're trying to say. To say nothing of the fact that they won't listen. Even if they were forcing themselves to try to listen, they just can't hear. In case you're dubious of that, just run an example that you and I have all lived through. Cast your mind for a minute and you'll see what I mean. Have you ever, for a client or your employer, had to go deal with a group of people that were pretty ripped off about something that your organization had done? Now, when you came walking in the room, I mean, was it all smiles and gee, how are you? Or was it just those eyes kind of looking at you? And if you just sat down and started talking about the subject, were they going to engage in a conversation, or were they willing to hear what you had to say? You know the answer. The answer is definitely no. And yet it's amazing how in organizations we continue to try to communicate and build relationships with publics that are feeling an abuse. And it clearly simply will not work. The second rule is the rule of participation. Of course, that's a rule from psychology. The rule of participation, briefly stated, says people will only get behind those ideas, projects, candidates, products, whatever, that they have had a voice in shaping. People will only do that they've participated in other words. And I don't think that needs any explanation. We all understand that, and particularly feel it today where we've been through a period in history where Americans now know their right to participate. And so a planning model must build in participation. And I already mentioned, of course, that we want our fellow executives to participate in the planning itself, which is just an application of the rule of participation. The third rule from the behavioral sciences that are important here, also from psychology, is the rule of rewards. The rule of rewards simply postulates that people will only do that wholeheartedly for which they are in one way or another rewarded. If you're involved at all in studying management theory, you'll be familiar with the work of people like Fred Hertzberg, for example, who postulated his theory of hygiene and motivation, in which he points out that some of the things we have traditionally considered a reward, good pay, nice working conditions, a parking